LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
This is BBC Television from London. Normal programming has been suspended.
This is an emergency broadcast from the BBC. Information of a possible nuclear strike against this country has been received. The current threat level is critical, meaning an attack is imminent. Civilians are advised to stay in their homes. Evacuations are currently taking place in the London area. All motorways and airports have been closed for military use. Non-essential telephone lines have also been temporarily disconnected. Please stand by and await further information. This is an emergency broadcast from the BBC. Information of a possible nuclear strike against...
Attack warning red. Attack warning red. Seek immediate shelter. Seek immediate shelter. Attack warning red. Attack warning red.
This is BBC Television from London. Normal programming has been suspended.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guests today are Randall S. Powers and Steven Konkoly, who join us to discuss their book, Practical Prepping, No Apocalypse Required. Prepping, or preparedness, is simply about taking steps in your life which could potentially be of great benefit in the event of a crisis or disaster situation. It has, however, become embroiled with the popular clichés of survivalism and images of groups or individuals holed up in armed redoubts with a million cans of beans and enough weapons to start a war. Back in the real world, beyond popular post-apocalyptic fantasies, there are many other more mundane events which have the potential to seriously disrupt our daily lives. Terrorism, economic meltdown, natural disasters and pandemics such as Ebola and avian flu regularly hit the headlines, but even something as simple as a prolonged power outage or severe winter freeze can and has left thousands of citizens on the back foot with inadequate supplies of food, water and other essentials with which to ride out such an emergency. The aftermath of Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy stand as stark examples of government failure in disaster management. They're not the first, and they certainly won't be the last. Taken in tandem with the potentially fatal interconnectedness of our modern industrial systems, and widespread public ignorance about the fragility of the infrastructure which makes our comfortable lives of consumption possible, a picture emerges in which we would all do well to do some serious thinking about how we and our families could cope should the worst happen. Practical Prepping, No Apocalypse Required isn't a book about ditching the suburbs for a heavily defended self-sufficient compound in the mountains. It explores practical first steps that you can take to prepare for the disasters you are most likely to experience. The book offers a layered, foundational approach that can be tailored to your circumstances and motivation level. You'll be surprised how little time, effort and hard-earned cash you'll need to put into practical prepping. Hello and welcome, Randy and Steve, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Hey, thank you for having us on board.
Thanks so much, Greg.
Okay, guys, today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues coming up in your book, which you co-wrote, called Practical Prepping, No Apocalypse Required. Before we jump into that, just tell listeners a little bit about your backgrounds and how you came to be interested in the whole prepping topic in the first place.
I'll let Randy go.
Well, I have a very small personal preparedness consulting business here in the States, and I probably started my preparedness journey, if we just put a round number on it, back around 2012, just to coincide with the creation of Practical Tactical. And around that time, I read a book called The Jakarta Pandemic, which is about a worldwide pandemic which kills off a majority of the population. And it deals with how one suburban man here in the States what would he do? How would he deal with it? How would his family react? Loved the book. Thought I'd reach out to the author because I enjoyed it so much. Sent Steve an email, and lo and behold, he just shot right back within the next day or so. And we just started talking, and from there, I guess the rest is history. I can let Steve take it from there.
It's been a long and sordid history. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's exactly as he described. I'd written the Jakarta Pandemic in 2010, and I'd started that, long before. I mean, it took me a long time. I wasn't very disciplined with my writing. And, when I wrote it, I didn't even know the term prepper. I'd heard survivalist. The concept has always been around. It's only more or less recently kind of taken on that name and popularity, or in some cases notoriety. But I really wrote this book from the heart in terms of, what I think, someone would need, to do and to prepare for a long-term period of isolation. In this case, I chose a pandemic, which is extra difficult because not only, do you have to be able to go without essential services for a long time, but you have to avoid people. You really, or at least you really should. So that was my background writing that. And when Randy reached out and I saw his background as well, we really hit it off, from the get-go, and continued that relationship through my next series, The Perseid Collapse. Which I had just coincidentally had just kind of plotted out. So Randy kind of became a consultant on that and has helped shape certain events and certain aspects of those stories.
Now, perhaps we should just say, for the benefit of listeners who don't know what we're referring to here, prepping, basically short for preparedness. You mentioned the word survivalism. So just give folks a flavour of it if they really are going, what is that? The term survivalism might be a little bit more familiar, but that's got, as you say, some negative connotations because it gets into sort of Red Dawn and Turner Diaries type area, and somebody locked up in a armored redoubt with a lot of ammunition and a lot of tins of beans type thing. So that's not really what we're talking about here.
Right. No, I think that's one of the things that allowed Steve and I to hit it off so well, is the fact that if you just give yourself over to what we see in the fiction, the kind of stuff that Steve writes and the kind of stuff you find in movies, that is wonderful stuff. I love that stuff. I mean, who hasn't watched one of those films or read one of those books and said, hey, what would I do? That's a crazy situation. But reality quickly kicks back in for me, and I become way more concerned about, especially living here where we live. In the United States, it seems like we're a big target. You could choose any sort of natural disaster, and it's probably going to happen or happen in a region near you. So for me, I look at the occasional winter ice storm or tornadoes. I even have to keep my eyes up for hurricanes and that sort of stuff. Drought is an issue where I live occasionally. So it's that kind of stuff. But even on a smaller, more personal level, you can have a personal SHTF situation if you have an unexpected job loss or an unexpected injury or something like that. So I believe that you should start your preparedness based on what you think your largest vulnerability is, because bad things are going to happen to us all the time. I mean, they happen every day. But you want to put yourself in the best position to deal with those bad things rather than just giving over to the panic that can sometimes follow. If you take steps to prepare in advance, what may be a disaster for someone else might turn into simply an inconvenience for you, and it's really not going to shake up your world too badly. So I prefer to focus on the basics, your situation, and let's just try to keep it as practical as possible. And if you do that correctly, you can then scale that up and build it out to meet virtually any challenge you want. I'm not saying don't prepare for whatever it is you think you need to prepare for. I'm just saying start at a reasonable, attainable position and then grow from there.
I've got, listeners all over the world, but it's significant that about 80% of them are split between North America and the UK. And then there's about another 10% in Australia and New Zealand, and then the rest scattered around the place. But for people who are thinking this is like something that's well established in certain areas of American culture, which it is, don't just turn off, because we're talking to people, no matter what their situation here. It doesn't have to be your classic, semi-rural or rural America with, people, again, people who know to use firearms, et cetera, et cetera. There's such a broad spectrum here. And we're not talking, I think in the book you refer to the allure of the post-apocalyptic sort of zombie fantasies about, running around shooting. It's all very exciting. It makes for great literature. But the chances of it being, obviously zombies aren't real, at least I don't think they are. But, mind you, look at the Congress.
No kidding.
But there's all sorts of situations that could unfold. As you say, from a natural disaster right through to something as relatively mundane as losing your job or sustaining an injury, where this stuff could come into play. So this is by no means aimed at one particular demographic. Everybody can benefit in some way from these sort of preparations.
Oh, absolutely. We, that's the big thing about the way we approach it, is we try to live a preparedness lifestyle. And essentially that just means, we look at our lives across the entire spectrum and then try to find ways to build resilience into it. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about income, revenue, that sort of thing. We want to create multiple avenues of revenue. But also, if we say the electric goes out for a couple of weeks, do we have a way to heat our home? Do we have a way to cook our food? When we mention food, do I have to go to the grocery store, or can I go in the backyard and pull food from the garden, or maybe the small stock that I keep, like my hens and things like that, who provide me with eggs? And we're just looking for resilience across the board.
Right. And if you don't mind me adding to this, I'll admit right now that I'm fairly lazy. So, with that in mind, writing this book, I really focused on, and Randy hit on this, your what if scenario, and it's just, it's your scenario. I make it very clear in this book that we're not preparing for, the EMP blast with United Nations, soldiers descending in parachutes and just this insane, Red Dawn-ish scenario. I mean, it could be just something very simple. As a 3-day power outage. I mean, I live in Maine and we have 5 feet of snow on the ground, and I know Randy, down his neck of the woods, they're getting kind of hit, with some, nasty storms there. Just being able to weather that without making a bad decision. That's the key, I think. I look at it without having to go somewhere or do something that might further jeopardize your safety. And I make it sound like really dramatic. And I really don't want it to be. Because, like you said, I mean, it can be a very simple scenario that you're just trying to weather for a short period of time. Well,
as you mentioned, it could be something like a electromagnetic pulse. Whether a weapon or whether from a solar outburst. It could be a dramatic terrorist attack, or perhaps something like Ebola or avian flu. Who knows? But in America, when you actually look at the stats, I mean, natural disasters are the one thing that come up again and again and smash people's lives every year, year in, year out. So that's
Right.
that's something you can bank on. You might not be able to say exactly where it's going to happen, or even economic problems. It could be completely non-violent, non-physical. It could just be something, a meltdown in the banking system that could cause everything to freeze up. So as dramatic as some of these scenarios sound like, I think that there's a tendency perhaps for people to think about it in extreme terms, and that then that's actually quite disempowering for them, because they think, oh, it'll be so hopeless, so they don't actually do anything.
Right. Right.
Exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head there, and that was part of the root motivation for why I wanted to start Practical Tactical and just do this in my own personal life, was because as we took our preparedness journey, we realized that there was a lot of stuff we didn't know, and if you start with some massive event, you quickly just find yourself feeling overwhelmed. There's just so much to learn, and you just don't know where to start. So one of our goals, my wife and I, she helped me put together the idea for the little consulting business, but one of our goals was to just put together a plan, a basic plan, in a way that anybody could understand it to get started. We took the perspective that you were starting at zero, and we wanted to help you lay the foundation so that you could cover your basic needs. And once you do that, you've taken care of 95 to 98% of the stuff that you're going to have to deal with just by looking at your situation. Now, don't misunderstand me, and I believe Steve will agree. We absolutely keep an eye on the bigger picture of things, but I think that feeds right into being a responsible adult here in America and practicing preparedness, because, as you mentioned, there are large-scale threats all across the landscape, and they're very real. And as I said before, you can take what we present in this book and in our other talks and blog posts and stuff and build it up. But to begin, let's start with a solid foundation and then take it from there. I think once you get that foundation in place and you're secure that you can handle a 2 or a 3 week problem, maybe a month-long problem, then you can open yourself up to the world of fiction. Not to say all these threats are fiction, but you can open yourself up to the bigger ideas. And because solar flares, I'm a huge fan of space weather. So I monitor the sun's activity at least 3 times a week. I'm keeping a radar on it. And as you mentioned, the economic perils that are out there, once you understand how money works, the way the 3 E's work together, terrorism, all of these threats that are out there are very real. But I think you have to have the foundation before you can allow yourself to wander down those roads.
Definitely.
Yeah, you mentioned food, so we'll turn to that, because this is one of the main areas. There's a whole raft of them, but that's certainly one of the headline things to look at. In general, I find that these days there's a lot of ignorance about where food comes from, how it's grown, how meat and fish are produced. I know a lot of people, particularly younger than me, but who can't even cook. Yes, you can buy storable food to have in for the event of an emergency, but this general lack of knowledge around it, I think, would have a great effect if a crisis was a bit more ongoing. If it lasted for weeks, for months, you then start to see people being sorted out from those who know about food and food preparation and growing and all the rest of it, and those who don't. So, as well as actual physically taking care of some of these areas, learning a new skill, gaining knowledge, I think could also be a good part of this.
Yeah, I'll speak out because, Randy's like the we call it varsity. He's in the varsity league when it comes to homesteading and raising food, small livestock, and and I'm kind of in my in my infancy. My wife and I and our kids, and we have a sizable garden, but it's just a start, and it makes us feel good. It's a great skill, learning how to to watch all the plants all year. Last year I did a kind of an experiment of growing beans because for us, we're vegetarian, so not like I always kind of joke, and there's no such thing as a vegetarian in the apocalypse. So, I will, I'm not morally opposed, but that's just the lifestyle we live. So, beans was a big issue, and I wanted to grow. I had never grown them before. And I did a little experiment to see how many pounds or what I could grow in a small area, and I kind of envisioned multiplying it out. And it's quite eye-opening when you really do this and see exactly how much space and how much effort and growing time it's going to require to feed a family for even just a short period of time, outside of canned and prepared foods.
I think you make a tremendous point, Greg, and that is, we started this conversation mentioning the word survivalist and things like that, and generally people think of exactly what you said, which is a room full of tin cans and dried goods, and those things have their place. But our main push would be to, again, let that be your base, let that be where you start, but then start to really delve into the topics individually, just as you said. So when you look at food, if I eat all my beans in my cans, well, okay, now what? Do I have to go take them from my neighbor? Do I rely on someone to come and bring me something else? I personally would rather understand how to grow a garden, understand what it takes to keep small stock, and this same principle applies to any of the topics we're going to discuss. So once you get that basic level, then you can start to really feel yourself grow and become empowered and gain a positive outlook when it comes to preparedness. And that is my main tool and weapon when I discuss preparedness with people who may not consider it, is it's just so empowering and it makes you feel so good. I know in our personal lives, preparedness and our holistic preparedness approach has just been a win-win-win on top of one another. I cannot find a drawback to it. Because with my young nephews, if we're working in the garden and they come to visit, the little ones enjoy nothing more than strolling through the garden with us and helping me water the plants and understanding, why we're doing it and what comes from it. And the first time they can pull a fresh carrot out of the ground, bang the dirt off of it and munch it, I mean, it's tremendous. They're hooked for life. And that's a skill that they'll just take and make stronger as they go forward. I think that's a tremendous point.
I listen to some American talk radio, of the sort of Alex Jones variety. Occasionally, there's only so much of it I can take, people screaming their heads off. But
right.
One thing I hear very often is advertisers selling preparedness products. And one of the popular ones is heirloom seeds. And as far as I can see, they may be perfectly genuine business, and nothing wrong with their product, but they seem to be selling these seeds to people who know nothing about growing. And the idea being that they're going to put these packets of seeds to one side, and then when disaster strikes, they're going to go out into the garden and plant them. And having, been involved with growing food on and off for years and years, it can be an incredible amount of work and a lot of trial and error. And the first thing I ever planted as a child, I don't know why, but it was onions. And the crop from seed, and the crop almost completely failed. And I don't know why, but obviously I learned as time went on. So I think when you're looking at your preparedness products, you don't need to have a lot of fancy, expensive kit or products. It really can be basic everyday stuff that's suitable for the job. For example, if you're going to have an extra tin opener and put it away with your cans, you don't need a super duper NASA tin opener. You just need a regular one.
Right. It's amazing. I work. My day job is I work. I've worked as a journalist for more than 20 years and across all forms of media. And it's amazing. I work in a major metropolitan city, so when I talk to people down there who don't get outside the perimeter, as we like to say, it is astounding to hear them pitch questions back at me when this discussion begins, because I can count, take up an entire hand, the number of people who don't even own a can opener, or if they do, it's electric, and they have no idea how to get into the cans if they don't have their electric can opener. It is astonishing, and that's sort of surprising to me because, again, I grew up rural, so most of this stuff was just built into my childhood and my rearing. But it doesn't take long for me to realize that not everybody grew up that way, and that's why this sort of stuff can be relevant, to people. Yes, we take it from a beginner's perspective, but at least to begin with. I mean, we get into some more advanced stuff later, but there are people out there who just have not allowed themselves to think about it.
Right. No, Randy, it's funny. This is a great topic because you can come up with so many different examples, the can opener being the best, or the 2 years of dry, dehydrated food, but only 2 weeks worth of water. So
Absolutely.
you run into, and then no practical or knowledgeable way to secure clean, drinking water beyond what you've stored in the basement or in your bathtub. Yeah, and the heirloom seeds, boy, I mean, it's, it sounds all fun and dandy, but you're absolutely right. I mean, I think of, harvesting seeds from plants, from, stuff you're growing, and that's what you'd have to do with it. That's the whole point of the heirloom seeds, is you can reuse, if you know how to actually capture those seeds again. And that's something we've been working on, and, with mixed success, to be honest with, because we've just started this. So, yeah, that practical knowledge is really important, and just kind of starting, and and it doesn't even have to be a big garden. You could have just a small one. I know not everyone has access, to the amount of land, and space. So, but even just doing it in your, in a pot on your deck or your patio or, balcony, you can kind of learn these skills without making it a big project.
Sorry about that, Steve, but
no.
That's absolutely right. And again, Greg, that's a wonderful point, because I personally feel that's one of the largest pushes that I want to make. Is I like to be a cheerleader for preparedness. I mean, again, I can't find a negative thing about it. It requires work and attention and focus, but since when are those things a bad thing? So the idea that you can just buy an heirloom seed and have that word mean something magical, it just doesn't work that way. And you guys have illustrated that point. I've often said, one does not take a handful of seeds, walk out in the yard, toss them around, and then 6 months later, you have a garden that will produce meals for you. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. And people seem to think that they can buy their safety. And in today's society, that is a refrain that I wish we could quiet a little, because you just have to put in the work.
With regard to food, one of the simplest things that you can do to get started, and you point this out in the book, is to simply pick up a couple more items when you're doing the shopping at the supermarket. And I had this thought, I think it was the earliest time I started thinking about this. I think it was about 2005, 2006. It was one of the, I can't remember if it was avian flu or pig flu, but this flu pandemic was going to sweep the globe and millions would die. Of course, it never happened, but that was in the news.
Yeah.
And as much as I didn't buy into that, I thought it did get me thinking. It's like, okay, well, what if I decided that I'd really rather not go out for a week or two? Just hedge my bets and stay in. What would it take? Assuming the water isn't cut off, because if that's cut off, then you're into problems. But I just thought, well, all it would take is a couple of cans of food per day just to keep me ticking over, in a reasonable state of health. So I just started adding in the extra, and it feels good, and I just rotate it, and I'm not being paranoid or anything like that. It's just, it genuinely feels good just to have that there, because in the world we live in, as much as it's like not as scary as a nightly news might make out, we've seen in other parts of the world, in some of the problems they've had in Argentina. We saw the aftermath of Katrina and Hurricane Sandy. Actual problems. I remember watching this woman in the aftermath of Sandy, stood on the news being filmed, beamed out, screaming her head off that Obama had to come and help her. They had nothing. Yeah. They had, never mind a tin opener. They had nothing at all whatsoever. Right. They were living day to day. And that was a major problem whenever their house got knocked down.
Right. Yeah. And you don't even have to look to an event that large. I believe it was the summer of 2012 where we had a massive, what's called a derecho, which is essentially just a line of straight line winds that wound up crossing an area as large as 3 or 4 states and it blew from the Great Lakes right out towards the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area. And as it went, it was like a bulldozer. I mean, it just plowed down electric infrastructure, destroyed homes, knocked down trees. And by the time it got to D.C., there were complete parts of the city that were absolutely blacked out, as bad as anything you had seen in any of the major events you listed. And it went on for more than a week. At the same time, they were having temperatures that were in excess of 100 degrees every day. The most heartbreaking scenario I saw out of that was the stories were everywhere, but they showed one woman who happened to have 3 very young children. They were all under the age of 4, and they had no electric, so they had no sort of air conditioning. They had no refrigeration, which means all their food had gone bad because they were day to day. And she was reduced to having to walk door to door and literally beg people for water for her children, not to mention food or anything else. In what was a destructed landscape, the children didn't have the appropriate footwear on. It was just one bad situation on top of another. And I just thought, how could I ever allow that to happen in my life? And that, again, are just one of those things that reinforces why it's so necessary. And it's really, really very simple. You just have to find a good starting place.
Yeah, and it's not about feeling somehow superior, because if you have taken some of these measures, yes, you're better off, but you don't want to be surrounded by people who've done nothing. Much better that all your neighbours and friends and relatives have all done their own version of this sort of thing, so that there isn't people going door to door. And, you know, we saw how Katrina, I mean, there was a mixture of cooperation and competition, shall we call it, in the wake of Katrina. But it didn't take it very long. I was surprised was I surprised? I don't know, how quickly it went from like, oh shit, through to like murder and rape and pillage.
Yeah.
So it was a small minority, but they were still doing it.
Oh, absolutely. Sorry, Steve, but
I was going to turn it over to you, but just saying that this is one of the most interesting topics, and it's the one I explored the deepest in my first novel, The Jakarta Pandemic. You know, I had a character who was reasonably prepared, actually, very well prepared in his mind, and he had all the physical trappings that you would need, enough food to last, way longer than you would need. But the one area where he completely sort of failed was kind of building this consensus that you described in terms of your neighbors and your surroundings. Because, if you live in an apartment building and, you're the only one that has taken preparations, or maybe a few other people, you have a lot of other people who haven't, who are going to be going door to door. And it's a really tough topic. And I know Randy and I have talked about this, about kind of building, little alliances. It's a very difficult topic. You don't want to advertise your preparations, but at the same time, you do want to be an advocate to the people around you.
Yeah, Steve, he says exactly right. That's always a big point of contention, is how much do I disclose the steps I've taken to be more prepared. And I just always tend to take the perspective that the more people who are prepared, the more people who put themselves in a position to be part of the solution, and less of a drain on the system. And I'm not trying to imply that if you haven't done anything, that's all you are, is a drain. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I am saying that if you have a major disaster and governmental bodies like your state disaster associations, or even at a federal level, come in to assist, the fewer people they have to tackle, the easier their job is going to be. So if I'm more prepared, I can take care of my family, and hopefully I can help my neighbors that are nearby. Now, with that said, again, you don't want to disclose everything you're doing. There's a fine line there, and you have to make a case-by-case assessment. So if someone is dismissive of your activity, or, they become aggressive in the way they discuss it with you, that might help you make a determination straight away that that's someone that you have to be more wary of than you may be willing to partner with. So each situation is its own thing.
Before I move on beyond food, I'll just throw in a couple of thoughts that are a bit random there. One is, I live in an apartment block, and I did manage to find a book that was dedicated to growing vegetables in an apartment block.
Great.
Good job.
So
Yeah.
I think it's actually called Gardening in Small Spaces, I think, but it's perfect for people with little or no outdoor space. And also, just on the notes that, as you would expect, you to cover keeping animals, but also hunting, as a skill, that because, there's always, nature can provide food, when the larder goes bare. But, I mean, there's more people keeping a few chickens in the yards, in the UK than there used to be. Well, probably not than there has been for a while, let's put it that way. But the culture of hunting or even fishing for food here is borderline irrelevant. I mean, the guys I know who fish, they do it for sport. They throw the fish back, and the idea of going out and shooting animals for food. I mean, if you're lucky, you can maybe find someone who traps rabbits or something, but it's very rare.
Right.
Yeah, and down here in the South, the South part of the United States, I mean, I'm surrounded by people who still consider themselves very much country folk. They love to hunt, they love to fish, and they understand it. But those are still skills you have to practice. For anyone who, if you own a rifle, that doesn't automatically make you a deer hunter. So you have to practice those skills and stay on top of them before they become applicable in any way.
Right. Fishing is not as easy as it looks or sounds by any stretch of the imagination.
No, not at all. I mean, I fished for years and I caught virtually nothing. Honestly, I was surprised because other people that I'd gone fishing with seemed to have better results, but they said, well, don't be, that this is not an uncommon experience. So I think that's probably why I gave it up, because it was kind of like, well, it's a nice picnic and everything. You've got your sandwiches with you, but really you want to be going home with dinner in the shape of a fish, and it didn't work out.
It rarely does.
You mentioned there about government agencies coming in, and we saw some issues there, certainly in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, for example. And it's almost like they're a bit schizophrenic. There's this centralized control. I'm thinking mainly of the US government now, but it's true in lots of other countries. In some ways, they've got their little websites with suggestions for citizens, which is really not adequate at all. It's just more like a token. Maybe if you do this in the event of a hurricane, you'll be okay. There's also part of the government that seeks to discourage independence, almost demonizes people that want to set themselves up and look after themselves. It's strange, you saw them going around taking guns from people after Katrina, for example, but then simultaneously failing in other areas to provide the services that they said they would provide. Don't you look after yourselves, we'll do it. So there's definitely that, I think schizophrenia is the best word for it, really.
Right.
Oh, I think you're hitting it spot on. And just to sort of tie this into your previous statement about how things are slipping away, like the access to those skills of being able to be more independent and fend for yourself. Even here in the United States, I know that just 2 weeks ago, I saw an article where the state of Michigan now has passed a law where they have stripped its citizens of the right to grow vegetable gardens in their yards. The law has been on the book for years and years, and it finally has come around to where the city, it started at a city level, they didn't like the way the gardens make the front yards look, so they were essentially treating the entire city as one big HOA, and they have revoked the citizens' rights to even have a vegetable garden in their front yard. They've lost the right to grow their own food and create resilience and independence in their food supply. And even here in Georgia, which is just about as, I mean, on a massive scale, it's just about as conservative as you can find here in the United States, but there are locales where raising backyard chickens and things like that are not allowed. And people are just trying their best. It feels to people like me who enjoy that sort of stuff, it just feels like people are trying their best to push any ties to that sort of resilience and independence, just push it out of the picture, out of the frame. And I really find that very saddening and frightening.
Well, yeah, what was the, obviously it'll vary from case to case, but one I read about, well, I've read about more than one case like this, where the city preventing residents from growing vegetable gardens, particularly out the front of their property, was basically due to objections by other people who were paying quite high property taxes, in quite a nice area of town, and they didn't want to look at these vegetable gardens. So there's an element of that. That's also a bit like, that's the same mentality that I've seen here in London and definitely in some US cities, where again the city is preventing citizens from feeding homeless people, particularly in downtown, because what they're doing here is they're trying to make increasing poverty go away, just make it invisible, so therefore suddenly it doesn't exist anymore. So but I don't know how much of it was that and how much of it, well, what else could explain why they'd be stopping citizens growing vegetable gardens? I mean, you would imagine that it was to be encouraged.
Well,
go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's very typical, I think, here is, so yes, depending on your neighborhood, I mean, do you want a giant forest of garden, corn in the front yards? It looks odd. But at the same time, it looks odd because, we're just not accustomed to it. And, when you really look at what the person's trying to accomplish, it's quite amazing. But we typically see here, they can't just use common sense and say, all right, keep it out of your front yards and just keep it in your backyards. Instead, they ban it all. It's always happening, whether it's an overreach or just lack of common sense or intelligence. So now you have backyard farming is banned too, which is just baffling to the mind. And with the drought, and these restrictions have been in place forever. I mean, you have some municipalities I know out in California in certain areas where it's actually illegal to collect rainwater, in some cities as well. They want all the rainwater to go into the system so it can be reclaimed and processed, through the sewers, which is, so that's crazy too. You're in a drought area where someone is maybe trying to funnel water into a cistern, something that they can use for their own, personal preparedness and resiliency, and they can't even do that. The rain coming down from the sky is actually illegal to capture and contain. It's insane.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how you enforce that, short of going, jackbooted thugs going door to door, sort of looking at your, as you say, your cisterns or your water barrel out the back.
Right.
Well, the idea...
And there are instances where it feels that way. I know there are certain cities in Northern California over the last couple of years where they have people whose only job is to drive around in city vehicles, monitor things just exactly like this. And if it looks suspicious, they will send a notice or whatever first, and then the very next thing you get is a hefty fine. Not a small one, but a large fine to tell you can't do that. And people are always trying to find ways to skirt around it by using things like gray water out of their washing machines to water their window box gardens. I mean, people, they are rebellious if it's something that they really want to do, but it seems overwhelming. It feels overwhelming at times that we would have to try to sneak around and do that.
Aside from doing a few interviews, I've been keeping a close eye on the water situation in various parts of the US, particularly the southwest and south generally. We're starting to see significant problems coming along. And you got a city like Austin expanding exponentially with no plan of how they're going to get water for these people. And I do wonder at what point that's actually going to become too jarring, and that's going to be like, okay, we do not have enough water currently for as demand stands. I mean, I was watching a TV news item the other day about Brazil, and in some parts of Sao Paulo, I think it is one of the big cities anyway, they're down to 3 days of water per week. They just shut it off the rest of the time because it's the only way to limit demand. And so I just wonder at what point a US city might run up against that, because I can imagine that would be a huge psychological blow to have to deal with something like that. To say somewhere like LA, okay, we're going to go down to just 12 hours of water every 24 or something like that. I mean, that's be a colossal admission of failure.
Well, I think the answer is pretty simple. And I'm sorry, Steve, I'll let you jump right in because I know you've got a lot to say about this. But even over the last just year or two, we've seen cities in Northern California that literally are down to, a week or less of water at any given point before they just have to cease. There will be no more, so they really have to put restrictions. And it's pretty simple. Water is fundamental. You can't do without it. Like if the electricity goes off, you can sit at your desk and you might be able to do some work or whatever. But if the water goes off, you've got to leave. It's just that simple. And as we look at the Great Plains and the American Southwest and California, there is a very, very tenuous future ahead if trends continue the way that they currently are going.
Right. It's so this is near and dear to my heart because my next post-apocalyptic dystopian series is going to focus on. It's going to be set in the year 2035 and will feature a drought-racked Southwest. So California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, all these areas. And I'm using trends that are, that have just been worsening. Randy's been feeding me a lot of fantastic articles, about localities, big picture stuff, and it's quite frightening. If the weather trends hold, and the aquifers continue to be drained, and the aquifers are large, and they're natural underground reservoirs that are filled with. They're either filled by rainwater, a number of different ways, and they're draining at unbelievable rates. So this could be very much a reality. And in my world, I'm envisioning, just like you described, Greg, like a very dystopic, almost Big Brother state where your water consumption by the individual household is very, very tightly regulated.
We interrupt this program. The Office of Civil Defense has issued the following message. This is an attack warning. Repeat, this is an attack warning. Attack warning means that an actual attack against this country has been detected, and that protective action should be taken. Important instructions will follow in 30 seconds.
And I talked about food and about water to some extent. There's lots of other areas in the book that you devote chapters specifically to: communications, energy, first aid, sanitation, being just four. We're not going to have time to walk through all that in detail. In any case, people should buy the book if they want to find out what's what. But one thought extending from a point that was made a few minutes ago is that there's I would say, a potentially fatal interconnectedness of a lot of our systems that we depend on in industrial society, whether that is energy or water, whatever it happens to be. And thinking about food and other regular items you'd get at the store, you have what's called just-in-time delivery, where, just before Walmart runs out of whatever widget it happens to be, a truck arrives with a load more widgets. And if there's any interruption in that system, well, the shelves go empty, again, which we saw in the events of the various big headline hurricane events. And the system, overall now, the systems are so complex, and I say each connects in some way to the other. That makes it very vulnerable, and I don't think people are really aware of how fragile the infrastructure is.
Oh, Greg, this is exactly why I was so excited to have an opportunity to speak with you, because I know I've heard you discuss these sort of things in the past with people that I really look up to in this area, and I just absolutely everything you said is absolutely on point. The just-in-time delivery system and the complexity of our Western civilization, and I'm not only talking about what's here in the United States. I mean, it is just extremely tenuous, and if you are brave enough to give yourself a chance, to look at it, you will find out in a hurry why basic preparedness is something that we all should embrace and defend vigorously.
An issue I touched upon at the top of the hour has relevance here to what sort of steps that an individual might want to take. And that's whether you're looking at a sudden event where things go south overnight virtually versus some sort of slow decline. You might look at, say, for example, the water situation we've just been talking about as a slow decline. Right. We've got lots of warning about. If you know what you're looking for, you can say, look, there's trouble coming down the line here. That might even involve, one of my guests came on and he moved from LA to Canada. And he said, there's going to be a lot more people following after me. He said, I've seen what's coming down the line. I'm getting out. So whether it is something that happens overnight, you wake up in the morning and your house isn't there anymore because of a hurricane, or you can see long-term trends. Yes, there's still some of the basic preparedness things you can do, but that will help inform what sort of preparations you take.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Again, our idea was to take the basics, cover the basics, so hopefully if there's something that does happen that's completely unexpected, you don't have to spend your time thinking about, wait, what am I going to do? Because you already have a plan in place. So that would be the answer to the overnight disaster. You can just quickly move on to, how do I work through this problem, or how do I survive this threat if the threat is that large? But as I said earlier, I know that Steve and I both, me in particular, I love to take the long-range view and look at everything from resource depletion all the way around to the economic states and things like that. I just think you have to open yourself up to what's out there to be completely informed and give yourself the best opportunity should something go sideways.
Right. It's interesting you bring up California because, I kind of, I'm like uber focused on it. And one of the aspects, I won't go into why my wife and I have studied this, but in LA, that whole area there on the San Andreas, extending south, that has a potential. It's a combo event of what you're describing, long term, and overnight, because I think it's pretty fairly well established by seismologists, and I mean this isn't conspiracy or end of the world theory, is that within the next 25 to 30 years, they're predicting with an 85% accuracy a 8 to 9 Richter scale event, based on all the tremors. I mean it's a scientifically established likelihood, and that would be a absolutely devastating event. It's a long-term one you could start planning for now, but I don't know what that plan involves other than, like you described, people leaving and finding somewhere else to live, because the odds are within the next however many years you're going to wake up and very likely your house is not going to be there, nothing's going to be there, nothing you can recognize. So I think that's a fantastic scenario.
Yeah, I don't know what the official response would look like to that. I mean, as I say, you base it on, Katrina was absolutely devastating, but nothing on the scale of, what you're envisioning there. So who knows what sort of chaos there would be.
Well, the spinoff from that, and we keep going back to Katrina because that is the visual that's seared into our brains, as it should be. We should learn from it. But people tend to forget that when you look at Katrina, New Orleans had a flood. The Mississippi Gulf Coast experienced a hurricane. When you walk down through Gulfport and Orange Beach and those areas where landfall actually happened on the right front quadrant of Katrina, you don't see anything except huge piles of rubble for hundreds of square miles. Like, it wiped the slate clean. New Orleans had the slow motion impact of the flood that stranded people. I mean, that was a two-sided problem, just like you guys were discussing with California. Yes, there's a long-term issue of both quakes as well as the drought, but if you had a major quake in a city like San Francisco, and keep in mind the World Series earthquake, I believe it was 89, that, broke the bridges out there and shook the stadium on the night of the World Series, that was only like a 6.9.
Oh, it's nothing.
The numbers, right, and the numbers that Steve are talking about, absolutely, I've read those same articles. Those are real threats, and if they were to experience something like an 8 or a 9, there's so much area in that Bay Area that is reclaimed land that, much like Japan, would give itself over to liquefaction, where the earth shakes and essentially water just seeps up through the soil. We're talking an epic disaster. And to think that a state government or even a federal government is going to be able to handle and put out all those fires at the same time is simply asking too much. And it doesn't matter. People talk about martial law and that sort of stuff sometimes when we're discussing things in this realm. But the facts are, we just don't have enough people or materials to be able to implement something like that. And the same goes for federal emergency management response. We just cannot ring all the bells, as it were. People are going to have to be able to take care of themselves.
Another issue just relevant to what we've been talking about is whether you stay where you are or relocate, and that would apply short and long term actually decisions. But it's just that if it was short term, you've got to decide more quickly. Would especially be an issue if others are doing the same as you. So if others are staying put, that might affect the viability of you staying put. And if everyone else is swarming out of the city, it might be better for you to wait and just see how things play out. And then, of course, you've got the issues we saw with Katrina of forced evacuation. That will be something else entirely to deal with.
Yeah, it can get a little bit mind-boggling, and that's like, Randy and I really, Randy especially talks about having a family preparedness plan, where you do, it can be as detailed or as general as you want it, but, where you kind of you at least talk about these concepts, because, I live pretty close to the coast up in Maine. So, if we got a tsunami warning, a sizable tsunami, I don't know how much time, warning we'd have. I'd love to think we'd have that deep ocean warning and would have hours, but you may not have that time, and even hours. Like you said, you're going to be facing everyone leaving. So you have to be prepared to leave pretty quickly. Throw whatever you have in the car, whatever you have prepared. A longer term one. If you're looking at staying in place, that presents its challenges as well. But I think something that's acute or even comes up while your rest of your family's at work or at school. I talk about that in detail about, how to, just at least come up with a general plan, where to meet, who waits where, how long do you wait? Very few people think about this, but, your life can change in, an instant basically. And, walking 1 mile, it's not as easy as it sounds, for a lot of people.
Yeah, that's something we haven't touched upon, isn't it, really? Is like physical fitness, and there are all sorts of people with different states of fitness depending on their age and their general health. But that's something that you would notice very quickly if you found yourself in a disaster situation, was like, what condition am I in physically? Even if you have a long-term health challenge, can I deal with that? How do I get my medication? If it's just that you're out of shape because you've eaten too many donuts, it's, it's something to think about. It has an effect. For example, 5 years ago, I went on a long walk in Scotland, hiking, and did close to 100 miles in 5 days with a pack. Could I do that now? Do you know what? I'd want a bit of warning if you were going to get me to do that again, so I could try and build up to it.
That's, yeah. Well, hiking boots. I just bought. It's so funny. We laugh about this all the time. My birthday's coming up, and what I really wanted was a really good pair of hiking boots. I have some decent stuff, but my wife's laughing because her first thing is like, well, the rest of us don't have a good pair, not like that. And I'm like, well, looks like you're getting left behind. And I'm joking, but it's amazing because people think you're going to walk for miles and miles on end in a pair of rundown sneakers, and if you had to do it, you can do it. People have done way worse, but I don't know. I can't get my daughter to go more than like a half a mile, without just throwing a fit, unless there's ice cream at the end, promised. So people have to think about these issues. Are people willing to even go on the long walk, as I'd like to say? Not everyone is. So, that figures into your plan as well.
Right. And there are 3 points that I just quickly want to mention. And that is, one, you have to start with a plan. Get a plan, discuss these things. Yeah. It doesn't have to be overly dramatic. Just talk about it a little bit and get a basic understanding. 2, on bugging in and bugging out, our number one position is, why would you ever want to leave your home? So, if at all possible, we would suggest that you stay right where you are. It just lessens the chance of incident. And that's where all of your supplies would be. Now, if you have to leave, go back to the planning, have a plan to leave, and be able to then implement that plan if you decide that that's what's necessary. And on physical fitness, I tell you what, it's we take weekend trips. We just call them sort of outdoorsy trips, but we'll go for 3 days, get out in the woods and try out new gear or new camping equipment, or and there's a fair amount of firearms training and stuff that goes on when we're out there. And I tell you, at the end of those 3 days, and we're not walking anywhere except to and from camp and to the training ranges, but at the end of those 3 days, I mean, it's like I've just been beat with a bat, when I get back home. I just feel, and I'm not in awful shape. I'm a fairly young man, and but it's not what we do every day. And to just gloss that over and think that you're just going to walk out in the woods that's a bad idea.
Yeah, it also occurred to me when you were speaking there that depending on your actual location at the time, it will have a great effect on how things pan out, because more and more of us live in densely populated cities. Obviously, the US has densely populated cities. For example, I've been to Manhattan, and I don't see how you could fit any more on the island. But it's more likely in Europe to have more concentrated cities, with less driving involved and less sprawling suburbs and what have you. So it occurs to me that presents its own unique range of problems. If you're rurally located, that's one set of circumstances. If you're on the 25th floor of an apartment block in Manhattan, again, totally different. I know we've touched on this earlier, but it just occurred to me that when you see popular depictions of disasters and apocalyptic scenarios, one of the main source of problem seems to be people all on top of each other, suddenly all competing for the same dwindling pile of stuff.
Well, absolutely. Right. And I think a point worth making here, too, is we've discussed major cities and evacuations and things. And just for the record, there has never been a successful mass evacuation in the United States of a major metropolitan city that has gone without incident. Be it Houston around the hurricanes that followed Katrina, or New Orleans around Katrina, it just has not occurred where it went off without a hitch. So having a plan and then a secondary plan is something that should get some consideration. And really quick on your point about walkable communities in Europe, on one hand, that is, yes, the people are right there on top of one another. But on the other hand, if you push that out long term and think, okay, if we have a bad problem and we can see ourselves through to the other side, those walkable communities could turn out to be a huge asset, as opposed to what we deal with here in the United States, where everything is a commuter sort of situation where you have to drive 30 minutes just to get to your place of business or a shopping store or whatever. So the walkable communities in the long term are really advantageous. It's just, can you get to that long term? And that's what we're talking about, is surviving whatever it is that the initial problem is.
Yeah, when it comes to driving as well, I mean, what about gas? Most people, partly because it's extremely dangerous, most people don't store large amounts of gasoline on their property. No. So, and what's another popular image from disaster movies, isn't it? Cars snaking around the block at the gas station, and eventually the signs go up, no gas, and that's tough. You're not going to drive anywhere.
Right. And whether we're talking about a situation like Sandy, where the electric is out, and the gasoline pumps just won't work because the electric is out, which refers back to the cascading issues brought on by an over-complex society, or whether we are looking at it in terms of resource depletion, where it just isn't available. That is the idea of a liquid fuel shortage. People often refer to the electric grid as the linchpin for American society, and it is. Mm-hmm. But I say you can take it back one step further, and once you begin to understand that nothing happens without energy, and whether that comes from burning coal or natural gas, or for liquid fuels, gasoline and crude and oil, once you get your head around the fact that that is truly the linchpin of what we know and what powers our complex society, then I think you have a good starting point. And as for bugging out and moving on and things like that, you have to have a plan. And really quickly, we suggest that people take a concentric rings approach, like an archer's target, a bullseye. So depending on the scale of the problem, you have locales already worked out at various ranges away from what would be your home base that you could evacuate to if you had to. And then, of course, all the stuff, all the gear that it would take to get you there, all the planning it would require to make sure that you knew where you were going, all has to be laid in as well. But just by doing that planning in advance, which would cost you nothing, you can put yourself miles and miles ahead of the person who hasn't thought about it at all.
However inadequate the government's suggestions to the public are for how they should prepare for unexpected turn of events, it does seem from news items I'm picking up that I don't know what the government in the UK is doing on this score, but that the US government seems to be preparing for something like never before. I keep hearing stories about us buying however many rounds of ammunition and guillotines and buying body bags and, I mean, you've probably heard more of these stories than I have, and I've not looked into it to see actually how much of it is really occurring. But you get the feeling, particularly when you think about, on the international scale, you think about the Norwegian seed bank and what have you. So there's a lot of kind of, from officialdom, there's nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, they're doing the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been that way for years. All you have to do is look back to President Ronald Reagan, who was the first to really take the continuity of government idea and put it on steroids, right, where they establish a fallback in case of a worst-case scenario of nuclear disaster. How would we maintain government order? And there are a lot of conspiracy theories that are tied to that, and I'm not buying into any of them, or I'm not embracing any of them or dismissing them. I'm simply saying that the government does have a plan, and if they have a plan, it's probably a good idea that you also have a plan. And I think a lot of times the government gets knocked for not being able to get anything right, but there are intelligent people who are in those positions, in the think tanks and things like that are associated with the federal government. There are some smart people. And when you look at the future trends, a lot of which we've already mentioned, whether it be restricted energy supply going forward, or droughts, or climate change and how that might impact the citizens of the United States, it's a stone's throw to say, okay, the water's good today. If you take the water away, what happens? That could lead to civil unrest. We need to have a plan for that. And we need to have a plan to make sure that government continues to function. It's not a large leap at all to see how all this stuff can be very real and understand why the government is doing what they're doing. I just think it's wise that we as individuals are doing everything that we can do to alleviate our dependence on their planning. Because if the situation's bad enough to where I might have to look and think about accepting help from an outside source like that, certainly I would have deemed it important enough for me to take steps in advance of this problem so that I can deal with it on my own for as long as possible.
It was something that interesting came up on one of the Google Hangouts we did with, for the launch of the Percy Collapse Kindle World, which is like a fan fiction program for, the Percy Collapse series, my latest series. We had an author, Murray MacDonald he's from the UK, and, he was talking about how there just is not a widespread prepper culture in the UK and in Europe in general. And he had some interesting ideas as to why. I would love to hear your take on that. And we're not just talking about machine guns and
I
crazy stuff.
Just off the top of my head, the first thing that comes into my mind is socialism, in the sense that you've had more sort of left-leaning governments in Europe, particularly since the end of the Second World War, and people have tended to be more reliant on the state, whereas the culture in America, even though that's been changing, what with Obamacare and all sorts of other government sort of interference, not saying that's necessarily interference, but there has been government interference in people's lives. But the tradition, especially as from an outsider's point of view, the American tradition was rugged individualism, homesteading, pioneering the West, looking after your own, helping, people help each other. They don't go and look to what would have been for a long time a very remote central government or even state government for help. So that's just a general thought, really. That's sort of a cultural thing. And if you combine that with the distinct lack of much sort of rugged frontier territory in Europe, it's all long since been domesticated. I mean, the closest you can get to wilderness in the UK, for example, is maybe go to the Scottish Highlands. But even then, you're only a couple of hours drive away from a city. Right.
Yeah, and he was also saying he also thought it had to do with the fact that you don't have this extreme weather, that we get here, where entire cities are being smashed, year in and it seems like every month something horrible's happening. So he thought that might have been also related, where it's just a little milder in terms of that climate. I think the combination of all three probably explains it.
No, that is important actually, because although Europe varies, you get harsher winters, much harsher winters in Scandinavia, for example. They're all geared up for it. They've all got their snow chains and their shovels. And they know exactly what to do when they get to that weather. Right. Whereas the overall, the climate in the UK is so mild, generally speaking, that if we get a couple of inches of snow, everything just goes into meltdown. So we've been blessed really with a culture of 7 degrees and drizzle, if you see what I mean, because it's not very extreme at all. But I think actually facing real physical threats, like extreme weather events, I think that would certainly change things overnight. Who knows what the climate will bring us further down the line, if the Gulf Stream gets shifted off its normal course. But yeah, I think we've probably nailed it there, just the main reasons why there isn't that culture.
Right. I always joke around that your primary weather related threat there is the Russians.
Well, yeah.
That's the unpredictable weather, if you want to call it that.
Guys, as we begin to bring things to a close for today, for me, a key element in all of this is psychological. You talk in the book about cognitive dissonance and normalcy bias and the stories that people tell themselves about their situation. And I think if you look at situations like Katrina, which mentioned several times, and even something like the Nazi Holocaust, what's going on in your mind can make the difference between whether you live or die. And some of the people that came through extreme events like the Holocaust have said that's what they owed it to. They said because physically they didn't know if there was anything to live for. They were in terrible conditions. But if they were able to master their mind, that gave them a chance. And you see, for example, I'm sure you've seen that horrendous, it's just horrific to watch, post-apocalyptic film, The Road. You've got the couple who are the main characters, and he makes it. He survives through until he just dies. But his wife doesn't. At some point, she just cracks. And you can have all the water and all the food in the world. If you can't cope psychologically with a situation, then you're finished.
Absolutely. And one of the ways I like to look at it is, there aren't many things in this world that are exclusively yours, but one of those is your attitude. And those attitudes and how you deal with things will more often than not determine your success in any given situation. So whether it's your own personal safety and self-preservation, or if you happen to have a family, whatever you need to do that is going to spur you along to take steps to be more prepared to create that level of insurance for the group that you're concerned about, you should embrace it and use that to motivate you as you go forward. And your points on normalcy bias and cognitive dissonance, that is just something that's prevalent everywhere here in the United States. And there are tons of reasons for it, everything from our society as a whole and our consumerism and how we're more interested in dancing with the stars than we are with, how do I grow a garden? All those things, they all play into it. But just because nothing happens today doesn't mean that nothing will happen tomorrow. And if you challenge your own preconceived ideas and your own paradigms about what is actually going on in our society and take a look at some of the more scary aspects of trends that we see, I personally think it's really hard to not get motivated to take steps to prepare yourself going forward. So those are big monsters, normalcy bias, because who doesn't want to enjoy the life that we're enjoying right now? We want to believe we can go to the market and pick up, I can get lobster from Maine here in Georgia without an issue. But then if you stop and think about what it took for me to get that lobster, everything from resource usage to infrastructure to, the economic system that we have in place, it becomes a pretty daunting concept, So to be able to shuffle off that cognitive dissonance and understand that bad things do happen is a key component into any good preparedness plan. And we can never stop bad things from happening. They're going to happen, but we can mitigate their impacts on us with a little basic preparedness.
Right. I'm not going to, Randy said it way better than I could. I think, one of my main goals in the book we wrote, was to, it's definitely kind of a lighthearted look. And I say that because I didn't want this, neither one of us wanted this to be a didactic, lecture like, you must do this or else. We wanted to just, really kind of, and I do it all the time, just small, trying to just chip away at the small little, maybe challenges or blocks that people have, and getting them just to take even just the most minor steps. I think that goes miles into kind of combating that cognitive dissonance, or any kind of normalcy biases they might have, because, no one wants to live their life in a silo, and eschew everything that, I'm a consumer. I'll admit it, day in, day out. I'm caught up in it, but I've seen the light to a degree, and, I think this book will help people to kind of just chip away at that. I hope.
Okay, well, Steve, Randy, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com. Tell listeners about your books. You've got various books out, your websites, anything else you'd like to share.
Sure. This is Steve. I'll go ahead and I'll let Randy go in a second here. So by trade, I'm a fiction writer, and I've written at this point 5 post-apocalyptic kind of prepper readiness themed fiction novels. One of this series is called the Perseid Collapse series. That's the most recent one. And you can find details of that at stevenkonkoly.com, and that's StevenKonkoly.com.
And as far as we're concerned, we're all over social media and the web pages, the interwebs, as I like to call them. So you can find our little website at practicaltactical4you.com, and there's a lots of stuff there, from links to all of our books and offerings, as well as we have a running blog there that's updated as frequently as I can turn my attention to it, and we keep an eye on everything from large-scale trends and issues all the way around to little tricks and tips to help you become more prepared in your own personal lives. I'm also on Facebook at Practac4U, and we are on Twitter, where we're very active, and the call sign is the same, at Practac, the number 4, and the letter U. So hit us up. I love conversation. I love to discuss this sort of stuff, and I know Steve does too. He has a little blog on his website, and we just love to go back and forth. So please reach out, especially if you have any questions or anything. And you can find the books on Amazon.com. I have a little addendum book. It's like our quick start guide, which would help you jump in once you've decided it's a good idea. And the Perseid Collapse series, the Jakarta Pandemic, all those books are really good, especially if you're trying to introduce someone who may be a little doubted about the idea of preparedness. These books are a really good way to sort of open their eyes and maybe give them a new look at it.
I'm so glad to have Randy here to say that. He does so much a better job at it than I do.
Excellent. Well, listen, guys, thanks so much once again for your time. Good luck with the book, and I hope to speak with you again sometime in the future.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for having us.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations or £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.